Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified.
Good evening, and welcome to News from Neptune for the 50th week of 2014. For more than 20 years, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcome, I'm happy to say, by the good folks at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight are David Green and Ron Szoke. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for more than twice the quarter century we've been on the air. Chomsky has said that in the American media, quote, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Our format is to take turns suggesting stories from the week's news that have been ignored or misreported, occasionally even innocently, and having our colleagues comment on them. Previous programs are archived on YouTube and posted to the Facebook page for News from Neptune, where you'll also find comments from viewers, not all unadulterated praise, and some answers from us. I also can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com. I'm happy to receive your comments. It's December 12th. 2 days ago, a federal magistrate found Georgia Walker of Kansas City and Chicagoan Kathy Kelly guilty of criminal trespass on a military installation as a result of their June 1st effort to deliver a loaf of bread and a citizen's indictment of drone killings to authorities at Whiteman Air Force Base. Whiteman Air Force Base, yes, sick in the original. Judge Matt Whitworth sentenced Kelly to 3 months in prison and Walker to 1 year of supervised probation for going on to the Air Force Base. In testimony, Kelly, a friend of this ground who's been our guest here, recently returned from Afghanistan, recounted her conversation with an Afghan mother whose son, a recent police academy graduate, was killed by a drone as he sat with colleagues in a garden. Quote, I'm educated and humbled by experiences talking with people who've been trapped and impoverished by U.S. warfare, said Kelly. The U.S. prison system also traps and impoverishes people. In coming months, I'll surely learn more about who goes to prison and why, close quote. This is not, in fact, Kathy Kelly's first time in prison. She has committed civil disobedience a number of times before in opposition to the war-making of the United States and has actually spent time in prison as a result. She writes about the current sentencing, 3 months in prison for walking onto a Air Force base with a loaf of bread. She writes, on December 10th, International Human Rights Day, Federal Magistrate Matt Whitworth sentenced me to 3 months in prison for having crossed the line at a military base that wages drone warfare. The punishment for our attempt to speak on behalf of trapped and desperate people abroad will be an opportunity to speak with people trapped by prisons and impoverishment here in the U.S. The prosecution recommended the maximum 6-month sentence. Quote, Ms. Kelly needs to be rehabilitated, said an earnest young military lawyer. The judge paged through a 4-page summary of past convictions, civil disobedience, and agreed that I hadn't yet learned not to break the law. What I've learned from past experience in prison is that the criminal justice system uses prison as a weapon against defendants who often have next to no resources to defend themselves. A prosecutor can threaten a defendant with an onerously long prison sentence, along with heavy fines, if the defendant doesn't agree to plea bargain. In his article, Why Innocent People Plead Guilty, Jed S. Rakoff draws attention to the institution of plea bargaining, which now ensures that less than 3% of federal cases go to trial at all. Of the 2.2 million U.S. people now in prison, well over 3 million, let's try that again. Of the 2.2 million U.S. people now in prison, the U.S. imprisons more of fellow citizens than any other country in the world, of course. Of those 2.2 million in U.S. prisons, well over 2 million are there as a result of plea bargains dictated by the government's prosecutors, who effectively dictate the sentence as well. In 2012, the average sentence for federal narcotics defendants who entered into any kind of plea bargain was 5 years and 4 months, while the average sentence for defendants who went to trial was 16 years. And this includes nonviolent drug crimes. The U.S. is the undisputed world leader in incarceration, as it is the world leader in military dominance. Only 1 in 28 of drone victims are the intended, guilty or innocent targets. 1/3 of women in prison worldwide are at this moment in U.S. prisons. The crimes that most threaten the safety and livelihood of people in the U.S., of course, remain the crimes of the powerful, of the corporations that taint our skies with carbon and acid rainfall, peddle weapons around an already suffering globe, shut down factories and hold whole economies in pursuit of quick wealth, and send our young people to war. Each time I've left a U.S. prison, writes Kathy Kelly, I felt as though I was leaving the scene of a crime. When I return to the U.S. from sites of our war-making abroad, I feel the same way. Emerging back into the regular world seems tantamount to accepting a contract, pledging to forget the punishments we visit on impoverished people. I'm invited to forget about the people still trapped inside nightmare worlds we have made for them. On January 23, 2015, when I report to whichever prison the Bureau of Prisons selects, I'll have a short time to reconnect with the reality endured by incarcerated people. It's not the rehabilitation the prosecutor and judge had in mind, but it will help me be a more empathic and mindful abolitionist intent on ending all wars, close quote. Kathy Kelly, one of the modern heroes, and who's going off to jail, and we might contrast her with a major criminal that we heard talk yesterday, the head of the CIA, who's been involved in killing and torturing people around the world for the Obama administration and before, who of course is having dinner at home tonight. So you're watching news from Neptune, a murderer as president, while the just are imprisoned edition. And we'll start with Ron Szoke.
I guess I have two things to say tonight. One is my usual moaning about the two Americas and the ever-widening gulf between them. New report in the New York Times, many feel the American dream is out of reach, the poll shows. The will-o'-the-wisp we've been hearing about for so many years and decades, the American dream, whatever that is no longer enticing or enchanting a whole bunch of people, it appears. So people were told, and are still being told by some endlessly, that if you work hard, work really, really hard, and play by the rules, then it's inevitable that you will become prosperous and achieve the American dream, again, whatever that is. And more Americans, I think, are becoming cynical about that. You don't get rich by working hard, they've discovered. You get rich by gaming the system, is what they see going on. So the Horatio Alger myth still has some currency among us. We heard it over and over again in the Republican presidential campaign of 2012 in Mitt Romney's convention speech, and many times after that, that people were born poor, had many disadvantages, many obstacles to overcome, but they became wealthy by working really, really hard. And the examples were the Marriott hotels and the Staples office supply company, which, as it happened, were both apparently administered by Mormons. But
why didn't I think of opening up a Staples?
Yes,
right.
You are.
Well,
you missed your chance.
How did I not do that?
Yeah. So this, despite the fact that social surveys are showing that there's less social mobility in the USA. Social mobility, meaning rise or fall in socioeconomic status, than in many other industrialized and European countries. But a lot of Americans still haven't got that message. They don't believe it. They still think that America is the land of opportunity. And I think they're becoming less and less aware of the reality of the situation. So this says, despite an improving economy and jobs picture, the public is more pessimistic than it was after the 2008 financial crisis, that it is possible to work hard and become rich, according to a New York Times poll. The poll, which explored Americans' opinions on a wide range of economic and financial issues, found that only 64% of the respondents said that they still believed in the American dream, the lowest result in roughly 2 decades. Even near the depth of the financial crisis in early 2009, 72% of Americans still believed that hard work could result in riches. But they go on to elaborate this. Things have changed a lot, and so on. Look that up. Article by Andrew Ross Sorkin and Megan Thee Brennan in New York Times, December 10th. Meanwhile, another headline, 42.9 million Americans have unpaid medical bills. The personal debt situation in this country seems to be becoming worse and worse. Some slight relief recently because of the decline in gasoline prices to about $2.50 a gallon in many places. But there's still enormous debt out there, mainly of 3 kinds: student loan debt, which we've talked about here before several times, medical debt, and credit card debt. This concerns medical debt, and there are some figures here. The person with only overdue medical debt owes $1,766. Someone with unpaid medical bills or other sources of debt, possibly credit cards or back taxes, owes an average of $5,638. More than half of all debt on credit cards stems from medical expenses, and so on. So it's not looking good. The number of people in collection is amazing when you see that figure. So are you in debt? Am I in debt? Only for the mortgage, but nothing else. But there are a lot of people who are not so lucky, and I guess I should feel privileged.
You mentioned the name Andrew Ross Sorkin,
Yeah.
who's a New York Times writer. He's
Right.
not to be confused with a fellow named Andrew Ross. And he wrote a book called Creditocracy, which you can buy, which is a very good book, discusses all these issues. You can buy it through the OR online website, where you basically can buy an e-version of that relatively cheaply for like $10. And it's quite informative. And he was also interviewed by Doug Henwood a while back. So I would highly recommend that book by Andrew Ross. But I guess the other comment is that if you're, I don't mean to take this American dream stuff too seriously. I don't think anybody on the left takes it seriously enough to really even bother to challenge where this term came from and who is it who talks about it. But obviously, it's not anything that considers the sort of the quality of social life, the quality of communal life that enhances the qualities of whatever individual material success we might have in our lives. And I don't know whether this term stems from the post-World War II era with people moving to the suburbs and this ideal of having a house and 2 cars and that sort of thing. But it's certainly something that is it's taken for granted much too much as anything at all worth talking about.
Yeah. Well, the idea was you would have a secure lifetime job,
Yeah.
and your children would have a easier life than you would. You would have enough
Yeah.
money to send them to college and so on, and all of that has disappeared. Almost everyone now believes that their children will have a harder time in life and less money than they have.
But even the ideal that your children will do quote unquote better than you leaves a lot to be desired in terms of a social ethic. I mean, better off than you means consume. Does it mean consume more? Does it mean more secure? Does it mean to have more meaningful work? Does it mean to live in a society in which people care more about each other? These are all the things that this terminology kind of precludes talking about.
Yes. Well, it's what it's, I think, designed to preclude. But,
Yeah, I think so.
But anyway, despite all of this, then, the recent lightening of the picture somewhat, consumer sentiment in the U.S. rises to almost 8-year high. So people are gaining a little more optimism, apparently, because of some of the things that I mentioned earlier. So consumer expectations are going up as we approach Christmas and so on. So how is your consumer confidence today?
Thank you, Ron.
It's at an all-time high, which isn't saying much.
Okay. My second point is the Senate report on the CIA torture operations that came to light this week, and some of the things that are being said about it. These absolutely hair-raising letters in today's local daily, the News Gazette, and so on, trying to justify it, or at least to
As
criticize
well as the column by Charles Krauthammer.
Right.
Overtly
Just
justified.
incredible.
Yeah.
So a survey reported by RT, Russian television, asked a bunch of Americans apparently, will those behind the CIA torture program be punished? The plurality of them said, 46% said not really. At most, a couple of low-ranking agents will retire earlier, which I think is probably true. The second most popular response was 43%. Despite massive protests and attacks on Americans, nothing will happen. The third ranking, down at only 7%, almost not registering. No one will be punished, but the CIA will be entirely overhauled, which seems unlikely. And finally, the last one at 4%. UN anger will push the U.S. to prosecute senior Bush-era officials. I think it's very highly unlikely. But anyway, there's an interesting article today about Switzerland has riled Israel, this says, over its decision to host a meeting of the signatory states of the Geneva Conventions, expected to slam Israel for its actions in the occupied territories. Israel pledged to reconsider its future cooperation with the Swiss. So this is viewed as an hostile act, reconvening the Geneva Convention of 1949. Switzerland convened the meeting following a request from the Palestinian Authority after joining the convention in April. This followed another stumbling block to U.S.-sponsored peace talks. Palestinian Authority Chairman Mahmoud Abbas wrote to the Fourth Geneva Convention calling for a special session. The Foreign Ministry spokesman from Israel, Emmanuel Naxon, said that Israel would not only boycott the conference, but will also reconsider its cooperation with other Swiss diplomatic initiatives.
Wait a minute. You said the word boycott.
Yes,
You can't use the word boycott about Israel.
Right. He said Israel views the Swiss government's decision very gravely and urged countries where the Fourth Geneva Convention is relevant to boycott the meeting. So via this decision, they're saying Switzerland is lending a hand to the politicization of the conventions of the laws of war in general. Convening the signatory states is a political move whose only purpose is to exploit the important platform of the Geneva Convention for attacking Israel. So you can politicize something by accusing someone else of politicizing it. That's the gimmick, I guess. So the USA is going along with this. They will boycott it also. And so there we are, an attempt to revive the Geneva Conventions and what they say about war making and occupation is getting strong disapproval from Israel and the U.S. and they're going to stay away from it.
I think that the Israel lobby is about to find out that that in Switzerland there's $10 billion of art stolen by Nazis from Jews that has been stored there since World War II. I think we're going to be hearing about that any day now.
Yeah, yeah. So, I think that's likely as well. Well, the final report is about the attacks on Russia that are coming up now. Three prongs, essentially. Propaganda, of course, as always. Some cyber attacks and the oil price regime, which is aimed apparently at impoverishing Russia and collapsing the economy. But I'm not sure the exact mechanism by which that's just being done, but it's becoming more and more obvious.
Well, the mechanisms of international finance are pretty clear here in terms of what the U.S. is doing. As you say, Ron, I think the point of the American policy is to use its control of the world financial networks, and particularly its influence in Saudi Arabia as a major oil producer, plus American oil production itself, to wreck the Soviet economy. And they're doing pretty well. I mean, they've managed to drive the price of oil down by almost 50% from where it was even at the beginning of this year. $60 a barrel now rather than $120 a barrel. That's quite remarkable.
What I've been hearing is that the USA can't go much lower in the price of oil because it will begin to bump up against or down against the production price. But Saudi Arabia has a way to go. They can get by on only 10% of the selling price of the oil.
And the willingness of the United States to order the Saudi Arabia to take a hit on this issue for a while, to take one for the team, so to speak, is pretty well defined.
At the same time, there's some ironic blowback when it comes to fracking, by which it will no longer be cost efficient to do fracking, given the price of the oil. So, and that's being talked about as putting on the borderline some plans of the major oil companies to do that in certain places in this country.
Yeah, the cost of production, I don't remember the exact figures, it's somewhere around 40% of what they get for the oil. And oil is now maybe half of what it was a year or so ago. And they're getting too close to that, and it's no longer going to be cost efficient to produce this oil by fracking.
I think we have to think, though, the sort of thing that a major retailer might do in ruinous cost cutting in order to drive a smaller competitor out of business. It cuts its price below the point where the major retailer actually makes money from it, but continues to sell at that price because it knows it can hold out longer than the smaller company that wants to drive it.
Classic Walmart strategy.
In some sense, that's what the U.S. is doing with Russia right now. This is one of a series of financial weapons the U.S. is using to damage the Eurasian economy and to scuttle, insofar as possible, the Chinese-Russian conjunction, which scares the American 1% to death. And what we've seen the Obama administration do, quite remarkably, is show itself willing to wreck the world economy in order to reestablish an advantage over the Russia and indeed the Eurasian economy as a whole. This shouldn't surprise us. I mean, in some sense, that's what the Clinton administration did after the fall of the Soviet Union, when the Clinton administration was able to engineer the Russian leadership into putting a known dipsomaniac at the head of the Russian state, who did whatever the U.S. asked. It was Boris Yeltsin, up to and including shelling the parliament in Moscow at one point, attacking it with tanks. It was pretty clear what the Bush and then the first Bush and then the Clinton administration had in mind here. They wanted to reduce Russia to a third world country, a supplier of raw materials, oil and other things as well, but primarily oil, that was in no way a competitor to U.S. Worldwide control of business, and certainly not a competitor militarily. And what's happened is that the resurgence of Russia under Vladimir Putin has thrown a spanner into the works, into the American plans. And what the Obama administration has shown itself amazingly willing to do is to nothing short of risking nuclear war in order to try to reestablish the suppression of Russia, which worked so well in a previous Democratic administration under the first Clinton. This is immensely dangerous. It's not being talked about much at all. If we hear anything about it at all, we hear that Vladimir Putin is dangerously intervening in Ukraine. I mean, a flat-out lie that is standard fare. It's not even questioned. It's not even argued for. It's just taken for granted. But what's actually happening in the background is this U.S. campaign to destroy the Russian economy. Russia understands perfectly well what's going on. If you read what the Russian foreign minister has been saying recently, or what Putin himself has been saying in various fora around the world, which are not much reported in the U.S., but are reported in the German media, in Der Spiegel, for example, and in RT, as you mentioned, and elsewhere, they know perfectly well what the Obama administration is doing, but Americans don't. Right. And this is not new, but it is immensely dangerous.
So what you're saying is that the Ukraine, all these events that have gone on over this last year or so, really is a part of a much larger campaign to undermine the economy of the Soviet Union.
I think it is.
And their relationship with China.
Well, to establish or reestablish global dominance, right?
Exactly. I think American policy is presented to most Americans as reaction to crises.
Yes.
A crisis occurs, and suddenly the president has to do something. And the questions become, has the president responded to this crisis adequately, or has he been inadequate in his response to the crisis? Yeah. This is nonsense. American policy is remarkably consistent over generations, literally, because, in fact, the same people are in charge, and they have the same goals. They're trying to do the same thing. And in our lifetimes, this has meant that the United States, which was the dominant power in the world in the middle of the 20th century, is continuing to do almost anything, including killing people in great numbers, in order to maintain that dominance, or as George Kennan said, to maintain the disparity between the wealth of the American 1% and the rest of the world. The consistency of American policy, whether the president is a Republican or Democrat, whether we're talking about the Middle East or Eurasia, the consistency of American policy is remarkable. And it makes sense because the same goals are in view. And it works. Unfortunately, it causes a lot of dead people. You're watching News from Neptune. We're talking about the news of the week and its coverage by the media. David, what was on top of your list for today?
Well, Ron mentioned Israel, and I'm going to continue on that theme.
Okay.
This is a book by our neighbor, Carrie Nelson, The Case Against Academic Boycotts of Israel, published within the last couple of months, co-edited by him and a man named Gabriel Noah Bram, with a preface by an insidious character named Paul Berman.
Oh, yes.
And I guess the basic comment I want to make is, to paraphrase Noam Chomsky, what Noam Chomsky's problem with the with the BDS movement is, one of them, he has several, as does Norman Finkelstein, and the Chomsky-Finkelstein duo is often seen as being opposed to it. They're not categorically opposed to it. They just have some severe appropriate criticisms of it. One of Chomsky's criticisms in relation to comparing the BDS movement against Israel to that against South Africa, to the boycott and divestment sanction movement against South Africa in the 1980s, Chomsky says that the proper educational work hasn't been done to lay the basis for an effective pro-global, pro-Palestinian movement. And I might not have agreed with that a few months or a year ago, but it seems to me that there has been a real resurgence of the kind of propaganda that I thought was mostly gone from, say, liberal Zionists who understand fully well that something is very wrong with Israel, but still defend Israel from the kind of criticism that is characteristic of those who are actually active in the pro-Palestinian movement. So what we have here in this book, which I just wanted to show the cover of that, the jaundiced nature of this book is already sort of demonstrated by the cover, in which the BDS movement is represented by this demonstration going on in the dark, sort of evoking, the dark, and they show a demonstrator with is that called a Guy Fawkes mask?
Yeah.
Is that what you call that?
Yeah. Ron has provided us on occasion with Guy Fawkes masks.
So this is not it isn't meant to be a flattering image of those who on principle support the Palestinian cause and and support boycotts to that end. So what I want to say here is that, this is a really bad book, okay? It's a collection of about 30 articles, or 30 to 35 articles with 30 to 35 writers. Sometimes Carrie Nelson has 2 articles in there, and a couple of people names are mentioned more than once. But it doesn't give a good case. It doesn't give a good case that these people really care about justice in Palestine. They claim to support a two-state solution, but they don't really demonstrate, needless to say, they don't demonstrate any activism towards that end. Instead, they oppose those who are trying to do something. Having said that, I'd have to say that all this emphasis on an academic boycott to taking attention away from other approaches in the BDS approach, whether other kinds of boycotts plus mainly divestment from those corporations like Caterpillar that are obviously complicit in the occupation, is not a good tactic for the BDS movement or for the pro-Palestinian movement, and it gives these people a pretense to write a very bad book with a few sensible things about academic freedom in it, but also it reveals to me that there's still a lot of educational work to be done, as Noam Chomsky argues. What Carrie Nelson says in the introduction to his book, in referring to the long chapter that he has co-written about the history, called the history of Israel, is the following. He says, next we provide an essay-length history of Israel that offers background knowledge that many in boycott debates appear to lack. It corrects many popular errors and sets a minimum standard for what people seeking either to challenge or support Israel's institutions and its legitimacy ought to know if their politics is to be either factually or ethically grounded. Indeed, many of the issues that shape the current struggle are historically grounded. Some have been in contention for more than half a century. history always matters, but nowhere more than in the Middle East. And so after writing that paragraph, that high-minded paragraph, what Kerry Nelson and his colleagues, a local professor named Rachel S. Harris, as well as a historian at Emory in Atlanta named Kenneth Stein, what they proceed to write is propaganda, is a sort of liberal Zionist propagandistic version of the history of Israel that hardly mentions the Palestinian people and repeats all the same old nonsense that we had 20 or 30 years of historical revisionist work from the 1970s, well, until now really, but the heart of it was in the 80s and 90s, which helped us to understand what the origins of the Israel-Palestine conflict are. And when you look at the references that they use, the 17 or 18 references that they use in supposedly this important work, informing them of the conflict, you perhaps not surprisingly, but still somewhat shockingly, don't find any names like the main Israeli historians like Avi Shlaim and Ilan Pape and Gershon Shafir, and the main American critics like Noam Chomsky and Norman Finkelstein, as well as the main Palestinian Israeli historians like Edward Said and Rashid Khalidi, Noor Masalha, and Nasser Aruri, and others who give us, in my judgment, a very accurate historical understanding of this conflict. And of course, the purpose of this chapter is to whitewash the Zionist movement, the history of the Zionist movement, the founding of Israel, and the current ongoing occupation since 1967 of what is now called Palestine, which is 22% of British Mandatory Palestine, which existed from 1918 to 1948. So, unfortunately, after several years of not really having read that much more deeply into the history of Israel and Palestine, I have to go back and go through this 40 or 50-page chapter and just provide a few counters to what is being said, and so that it will be on the record. There's plenty on the record responding to the articles in this book. If you go into an issue of the AAUP, the American Association of University Professors yearly journal online, there was a journal devoted to this with rebuttals and counters and so forth that deal with a lot of the writing that some of the writing that ended up in this book. Other of the writing that ended up in this book also ended up in an issue of something called the Los Angeles Review of Books, which had one issue which you can easily find online, in which you will be able to read some more back and forth that includes some of these authors. But it's too bad that in the year 2014, the people who supposedly support two states in Israel and Palestine, those who actually are activists in that regard, still have to contend with those people who say they are for two states, but are doing everything in practical terms to block that from happening. And I will just conclude by saying this is the kind of thing, if you go on YouTube and look at some of Norman Finkelstein's criticisms about the BDS movement, basically what he's saying is, at long last, we need a practical approach to this very solvable problem. And he's critical of those who take the eye off the ball by proposing one state. And I think that's quite valid. And I think the biggest weakness of the boycott movement is they don't make that clear. And I think that they absolutely should. But beyond that, we apparently need to get back to the basics and make sure that those people who've taken an interest in this topic for the first time, maybe in the last few years, understand this legacy of historical research, which makes it very clear how we got to the point that we're at now.
Thank you, David. It seems to me that one of the ways that we need to clear up the popular discussion of this issue is to look at the parallels with South Africa. I mean, people on various sides of the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, people both for it and against it, draw a parallel with South Africa and say, look, apartheid in South Africa was ended as a result of that sort of movement, and therefore we need something like that also in regard to Israel. And there's at least a germ of truth in that, that the BDS movement is itself predicated upon the historical example of ending apartheid in South Africa. And you quoted Noam Chomsky a moment ago, who says that, in fact, the use of the term apartheid, which has been strenuously resisted by Israeli partisans, is absolutely appropriate. He says, in fact, apartheid in the occupied territories, the territories that Israel illegally occupies, that are where they're sending settlements in lands occupied now by Palestinians, apartheid there, he says, is far worse than what happened in South Africa between blacks and whites, even if within Israel proper, the relationships between Jews and Arabs, while still on a racist basis, doesn't approach the viciousness of South African apartheid. It's an important distinction, I think, because it shows that the issue really does remain Israel's illegal occupation. Now, what the partisans or what the opponents of the BDS movement want to say is, no, the issue is about the existence of Israel. People who are supporting BDS want to bring Israel to an end. They want to finish the work of the Nazis. They want to destroy it. I mean, and this is a wonderful way to twist the discussion. I remember well the anti-apartheid movement in this country, the anti-South African apartheid movement in this country, and no one ever said then, well, look, you people who are opposed to apartheid, you want to bring South Africa to an end. You want to end the state of South Africa. And that was, no one said that because it was patently false. It was ridiculous. What people were saying was that all the citizens of South Africa, black and white, should have civil and political rights within the one state. Okay. Now, that argument, as I say, may be seductive. History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme, Mark Twain said, you know, and all analogies limp. The analogy between apartheid South Africa and apartheid Israel today does limp, and the distinctions have to be pointed at and noted and taken account of. It seems to me that there was never, for example, in the discussion of South Africa, an equivalent of a two-state solution in South Africa. That's not quite true. As a matter of fact, there was a two-state solution in the sense that official South Africa said, oh no, black citizens are not really black people are not really citizens of South Africa. They're citizens of these little statelets we set up around the country, Bantustans and so forth. And that was, clearly false, and therefore no one, as it were, took it very seriously. The one-state solution was a given in South Africa. It's not a given by any means in Israel because Israel occupies these territories illegally, and the possibility of a two-state solution has been agreed upon literally for a generation by the world at large. So the parallels are not exact. And in order to use the parallels, in order to understand the current situation, we have to be aware where the parallels don't work. Yeah. The argument was not about the destruction of South Africa. Yeah. The argument is not about the destruction of Israel.
But I think what Finkelstein is saying, what I've sort of come back to in the last week or two after reading all this stuff and listening, is that the boycott movement, the BDS movement, in a sense, provides an opening to those, even if obviously nobody is proposing that any Jews are going to die, right, or be treated badly in a one state. He's arguing that if you're going to argue along international law, and this is always Finkelstein's point, if you're going to use international law and human rights law that has been established and has international support, you have to stick with two states.
Yes.
You can't then say if you're going to use that for Palestine, you have to use it for Israel as well. If the Palestinians are going to have their rights within that framework to their own self-determination, so must Israel have that right. And that sounds like a too big of a concession to many in the BDS movement. But I think that what Finkelstein is making, I think he always asserts himself as being the most politically, pragmatically, but still principled, astute observer of what's going on over there. I think that he understands the politics better than almost anyone. And again, if you go to that OR website and get his last couple of books about Operation Cast Lead and about Goldstone and about what's been going on there, the latest is kind of an overview called Method and Madness. He perfectly well understands what Israel's up to. None of that keeps him from saying that at this point in time, if you don't support the two states, fine, then you're not operating within international law anymore, and he thinks that's a bad move for the pro-Palestinian movement to be taking at this time. And he does say that people like the leader of the BDS movement, who's got a lot of press lately, he was in this country in the last week or two, a man, Israeli-Palestinian man named Omar Barghouti, is really being much too vague about the one state, two states. And again, that provides too much of an opening for people to accuse in their jaundiced way and in their exaggerated way of the BDS movement wanting to allegedly destroy Israel.
The question is the oppression of the Palestinians within Greater Israel.
Yeah.
And instead of dealing with that fundamental question, Israel's partisans, which means also the government of the United States, want to talk about whether the existence of Israel is threatened and, by the way, whether academic boycotts are a good idea. Mm-hmm. This is a conscious idea, a conscious effort to miss the point, a conscious effort to avoid the real issue, that is the oppression of the Palestinians, the solution for which has been clear in international law, as I say, for a generation. So this is a work of fairly sophisticated propaganda you have on the table in front of us.
Yes, and
David.
And now it's going to be yours after after the show is over.
There's a lot of propaganda around, and it's the sort of task.
I'm sorry to have to bestow it upon you, but you asked for it, and
you're
going to get it.
Very kind of you, I think. Thank you.
Well, it's completely routine and classic to keep injecting false issues.
Exactly.
And have a ready supply of red herrings.
Yep.
To throw into
the red herrings are running well in the in the political stream.
You really want to destroy Israel,
right?
And so that's completely false. All the faking and bluffing that goes on is really well. Maybe I'm naive. It's still astonishing to me that this goes on to the extent that it does.
But apparently, we still have a lot of work to do in educating people, and we should continue with that work. And if we have to give up this the whole idea of and I think we should give up to a great extent the idea of academic boycott and focus on the other aspects of it, as well as focus on supporting the Palestinians in Palestine themselves. I think the movement at this point would be better served by that.
And we probably should underline once again that none of the things that Israel is doing in oppressing the Palestinians would be possible without the support, political, economic, military, and diplomatic that the United States gives. And we as Americans are talking about American policy here. We're not telling the people in Tel Aviv what they should be doing. And it's important to keep that in mind sometimes, I think. We forget that. We forget that that's the context.
The pretense of most of these people who argue in this book and who say, why do you single Israel out over some of the other countries? Their pretense is that we're not involved in this. This is just something going on out there in the world that we would like to, we wish we were better and we wish we could help. But no, what makes this different, if it deserves to be singled out, it is because our government makes this happen. But people here have to work more on that as well as working on what's going on over there or boycotting Israeli products and so forth. We have to continue to educate our own people so that eventually there can be a political process by which our representatives begin to understand that the people do not support this. Again, another $3 billion in this latest budget, $3 billion, it even goes uncommented on in this $1.2 trillion budget. Again, another $3 billion for Israel's military, for us to give back to us to buy weapons, basically.
Once again, the absolute continuity of American policy is at stake here. Israel is America's chief client in the Middle East, the recipient of more foreign aid, which is largely military, than any other country in the world. And the reason for that is directly involved with the ongoing American policy of controlling the Middle East. Our stationary aircraft carrier in the area produces the greatest energy resources in the entire world. That doesn't change. That hasn't changed for generations. And the U.S. continues to act in accord with it. But that's a background that sort of drops away when we say, why are you singling out Israel?
Netanyahu uses that one constantly. Why are you picking on us? There are all these other terrible situations where people are suffering around the world, and but what about them? But what about them? And you terrible hypocrite, you're not attacking them, you're just bigoted against us, and we're being treated very unfairly. And he keeps harping on that one constantly.
We can't end News from Neptune tonight without saying something about the torture imbroglio, and this again, I think, is a story that is amazingly misreported. What most Americans think about it, and the responses, such as the ones you mentioned, Ron, in the local daily, responses in the letter column, show just how misled Americans have been about the horrible activities of Americans conducting torture in the Middle East that we've heard about because of the Senate report this week. But I think it's vital to notice that the Obama administration is working very hard to cap these revelations into the Bush and Cheney administration. That is, as far as we're concerned, the question is, what's to be done about those torturers in the last administration? Anything at all? And what we don't notice there is that torture under Bush and Cheney administration and torture under the Obama administration simply changed its outward appearance. It continued under Obama. It continues under Obama. And the policy is a policy not limited to a few bad apples in the CIA, or even that particularly rotten apple, John Brennan, the head of the CIA, who we heard an amazing speech from yesterday. It is a policy of the American government. In fact, probably more torture is being carried on by the Obama administration under the JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command, which is a separate military organization from the CIA. It serves the purposes of the Obama administration to say this was a CIA problem during the Bush administration. That's not true. Torture is the American way long before, by the way, even the CIA, if we want to talk about the historical background of it. And it continues within the Obama administration. Obama makes much of the fact that he issued a ban on torture when he became president. The only problem was it was a typical Obama move. Fake left, drive right. That is, you pretend there's a ban on torture, and in fact, the level of torture by American organizations, military and otherwise, increased under Obama, and the promises, for example, to close Guantanamo were gestured to, and indeed, nothing was done. What the Obama ban on torture knocked off was the small percentage of torture done by Americans, and particularly by the CIA in certain areas, while retaining the overwhelming bulk of the system's torture, which is done by foreigners under U.S. patronage and by the Joint Special Operations Command, active by their own admission in 130 countries around the world. An important article in The Intercept about the torture thing runs counter to most of the stuff you're reading elsewhere about the torture report. The American way, according to a CIA functionary who's quoted there, just kill all these guys when they're captured and we won't have this problem. That's very close to what the Obama administration did, why they substituted the drone killings for the capturings and sending to Guantanamo that had been the program of the Bush administration. So when we hear the Obama administration talk about what's to be done with the tortures of the Bush administration, realize that what we're doing here is a cleansing operation, attempt to try to cover over the fact that that's what the Obama administration itself is doing.
Is the Obama administration trying to block the prosecution of Bush administration figures or not?
Of course. Of course, because the prosecution of the Bush administration of figures would bring in the people who continued the same thing the Bush administration did. You would, as a lawyer, would be perfectly happy to take one of those cases because you could say, the practices haven't changed. They've simply changed their appearance. You've been watching News from Neptune for the 50th week of 2014, and Obama as Torturer-in-Chief edition, perhaps. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight have been Ron Szoke and David Green. Our thanks to our director and producer, Jason, and Dan tonight. Upcoming programs here on UPTV include Labor's Worldview, Sunday at 4, news and comments you can't hear elsewhere in the CU on weekday mornings, and more news from outside the bubble, as Harry Shearer says, coming soon here at UPTV. And on WRFU Radio, listen to Living Simply, first Fridays at 8 a.m. with Ron Szoke. And you might also want to see our new column in Smile Politely. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come, and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.